Good morning and welcome to a Star USA training webinar. Today is Tuesday, July 11th, and we have a really incredible panel here to talk about their areas of expertise, what they're seeing in those fields, and to answer questions. We are recording this webinar. We'll make the slides and recording available in the next few weeks. There's one NCB FAA continuing education credit available. I'll give the code for that at the end of the webinar. Star USA is a consulting, advice, training, and services firm located in Northeast Ohio. We provide an array of services. One of our favorites is sharing experiences and connecting with other professionals in the industry. My name is Jo Harper. I'm a principal with Star USA, and I will be your moderator today as our panelists share their knowledge and experiences. I'm going to briefly intro our panelists, and then I'll let them talk a little bit about what they do and their area of expertise. Nate Ward is a regional director of the Ohio Small Business Center Export Assistance Network Office and director of the Global Business Center at Cleveland State University. He also has more than a decade of private sector international business experiences, has visited 38 countries, and spent longer professional time in 7 of them. Nate also speaks several languages fluently. I can personally attest to the caliber of Nate's internship programs. I've worked with nearly a dozen of the interns over the past few years, and they're all fantastic. Lisa Lyon is the Global Strategic Trade Compliance Leader for Avient Corporation. She has more than 20 years of experience in trade compliance with both imports and exports. Despite preferring exports, she likes to live life on the edge. Lisa leads international teams in trade compliance that support business initiatives and keep companies compliant while providing a collaborative and excellent work environment for her people. My first experience with Lisa was when my boss, who loved to affectionately mock me for being a nerd, opened a spreadsheet that Lisa had sent over containing the outline of a project and started just laughing and told me, "You are going to love Lisa." Since then, Lisa has retained her legendary status at our company and remains a high bar of someone to work with. Dan Ujczo is senior counsel with Thompson Hines International Trade and Transportation Law Practice. He's extremely connected with the trade as well as domestic and international government agencies. Dan has served in the governments of Canada and the US. I'm only scratching the surface here, and I really hope that you will check Dan out and listen to some of his webinars and podcast appearances. Michael and I were geeking out over some of them this morning. And then Andrew Jeanblanc has spent the past nearly decade working on trade credit insurance and as a US Ex-Im Bank broker. He's helped small and medium-sized companies assess their domestic and international credit risk, finance, and sales needs. He's also worked on the ground in China and speaks Mandarin Chinese. He's based in the Cleveland area. I'm personally really excited to learn from Andrew because trade finance remains an area of compliance that I haven't really dipped my toe in. So I love making that connection. Andrew, would you start us off for a little bit on what you do and how that works?
Sure. Well, thank you for that introduction, Jo. And thank you everyone for joining. So I work in, we say generally kind of the trade finance space. My primary focus is on credit insurance. Basically, I work with a lot of manufacturers, a lot of distributors who are looking, I mean, everybody's looking to sell, but they're looking to sell, domestically, looking to sell internationally. And a lot of times, they may have some concerns with country risk in a particular, they're going to a particular market, payment risk. They maybe don't have the familiarity or experience with a customer that they're selling to, or they're looking at tools to help them grow their sales. So credit insurance would be one of those tools, and it's one of those trade finance tools because it gives you protection against non-payment. So you can offer open account terms and ultimately offer more competitive terms to help you grow your business and win sales. A lot of times, we're connected through a bank who may be looking at insurance for their customer. So essentially their customer is banking with them and they have foreign receivables. So we'll work with the exporter to put an insurance policy in place, which they can then use with their bank to allow them to have a line of credit or a working capital type facility. So we kind of touch finance in that space, and often we will have scenarios where our exporters, maybe they'll have needs on the supply chain side or on their procurement side, where they've got an order, but they have to figure out a way to, build the project, build the machine. So we kind of work on all sides of the transactions, partnering with insurance companies, with banks, with U.S. government agencies, as well as with non-bank financing partners. So we can talk a little bit later, but just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste.
Awesome. That's really neat. Thank you. Dan, would you mind introducing and doing a little bit of sharing? And just let me know when you want me to move slides.
Sure. Well, thank you again, Joe, and thanks to the Star USA team, some of the best around, and of course to our co-panelists and to all of you for taking your most precious resource, your time. As Joe was saying, it's kind of Nerdville here, right? In our world of international trade and transportation and supply chains. Nobody used to talk to us, right, until about 5-6 years ago when tariffs started being put on all kinds of goods, and then we had the COVID disruptions and ports were congested, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm with Thompson. I should note I am Canada's honorary consul to Ohio and part of the DEC and all these ties to various government things. I just say that only because the everything that I'm saying today, I'm speaking on my own behalf. I don't reflect the views of anybody, including my own law firm, Thompson Hine. So if you don't like what I say, you can blame me. So I'm just speaking in my personal capacity here today. At Thompson Hine, of course, we're one of the Ohio headquartered law firms going back 100 years or more, but we have offices throughout the country, including in DC, New York, Atlanta, Chicago. And, our trade team and transportation teams are pretty heavy in DC, and then folks like me out in Columbus, where I live, or out in Northeastern Ohio, or throughout, in particular, the Great Lakes region with companies every day. I wanted to just take a few minutes at the outset on what are some of the topics that we're seeing. So if we could just go to the first slide. And I don't want death by PowerPoint here, but in fact, what I may do is just use this slide only, and then there's several behind it, but we'll talk about some of those, but it's more of a reference resource. But I think the point that I want to emphasize today is, or the point that I do want to emphasize today, is that we're living in a really transformative time, I believe, in trade. Those of us that have been around for a while, the generation before us would say, oh, you guys are obsessed with China. Well, that was Korea, and then it was Japan before there, and then it was Germany before then. But I don't think this is a cyclical time that we're in. This isn't the normal trade cycle. Things change every 20, 30 years. I really do think this is a fundamental shift in how we're looking at, in particular, supply chains and trade, that there are significant policy decisions, political decisions being made that are really changing the way that we've been doing business for the last 30 years, really since the fall of the wall. And interestingly, I've been soapboxing about this for a while, and in the mid 1990s, we had something called the Washington Consensus, which was, the Soviet Union had just collapsed, Rocky had just knocked out Ivan Drago and won the Cold War, and that we were going to, unite the world through security, unite the world through trade, and then technology would follow behind. And what's interesting is just in March, Secretary Blinken, our Secretary of State, gave a new speech that said there's a new Washington Consensus, that what we've been doing, we've realized, and this isn't being critical of those around at that time, including many of our mentors, designed that framework for how we were doing trade. Flatten the world as flat as possible, get supply chains as lean as mean as possible, and then go from there. And then that would lead to peace and prosperity. But the fact is, it left folks behind, and it left imbalances. And some of those things you don't know until you actually try it. And so now there's the talk of a new Washington consensus. And I just want to end in saying in this opening, we're trying to figure out where the balance and the cost of all of this is at the big picture level, but also within our companies, right? Because number one is there's no question that there's a new trade paradigm really focused on that third bullet point, whether you call it nearshoring, ally shoring, friend shoring, et cetera. But that we started to see this again. This isn't a political statement, but during the Trump administration, which frankly had been momentum that had built from Democrats, from labor, et cetera, for 20, 30 years, from those of us from Northeastern Ohio. I'm originally from Youngstown, Moaning Valley. We had heard these things for years, and then that was captured in the big change was, of course, the Republican Party came along with that with President Trump, and you had this now. That is the center in terms of trade policy, that we're going to make things here or in our allies like Canada, Mexico, et cetera. Oh, and we're going to try to make as much of it as we can here with domestic preferences, like Buy America, Buy American, et cetera. Layered into that is the second point. The stated policy of this administration is worker-centric trade. That we are going to do things that Catherine Tai, our U.S. trade representative, has said that this is like health insurance. It's a premium. We are going to pay more for things so that workers are taken care of. And we see this in policies like in Mexico right now, the U.S. use of the rapid response labor enforcement mechanism, which is encouraging unionization in Mexico. In fact, Mexico has just finally said to the U.S. in the last week, like, time out, can you stop using it so much? And trying to bring these things on. And then, of course, everything dealing with climate change and green shoring. But I get to that first bullet point is the counterbalance to that is things cost more. I mean, that's just the reality of the day, that if you're going to have this trade policy and trade preferences and all of the things that folks like us deal with, think costs have to go up. I mean, at the end of the day, costs will go up for a while until everybody figures out how to balance that. And there's going to be these gaps. And I think that just makes it very challenging for folks that have to go talk to the C-suite or in operations that are so used to where the mantra is at purchasing and procurement, get it as low cost as possible, get it as, consistent quality as possible, but, keep those prices down. Well, now there are other factors. Do we have the resiliency in the supply chain, redundancy, et cetera? And that comes with a cost. And so I think companies are trying to figure all of this out. And for trade compliance professionals, where we have to have the competitive advantages, we have and the rest of the slides in here kind of go through, and we'll talk more about this, but the traditional things like, okay, what does sanctions look like? Well, now we have forced labor. Right. And then layered into that anti-dumping. And then we have steel and aluminum tariffs. And then we have China tariffs. And then now we're going to use free trade agreements like USMCA and others. But now beyond all of those, what I would call kind of our normal stuff, that's a very active period, probably the most active period I've seen. Now we have to start looking at, okay, now I'm going to use a domestic tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act that my finance team's using, but all of that depends on whether that was domestically produced or not, or hitting certain thresholds. Or now there's major infrastructure spends. My product is going, my company's product's going in there, but do we comply with new Build America, Buy America? Which means all of those trade rules that we use for sourcing and procurement, and now are stacked into that as well. Those, what are typically domestic decisions that may be housed over in the finance part of the department or somebody like that's trying to claim tax credits, and all of a sudden is going to say, where's this stuff coming from that's in our component? And so there's just layer upon layer now, unlike at any time I've seen in my career. And so it's good news for those of us in the trade and transportation business. I think it's going to be job security, but it also comes with very significant challenges, because at times we're going to have to say no, or you're going to have to go to the sales folks and say, we need to know exactly where that's coming from and what their supply chain behind that vendor or other looks like as well. And so, that's not something the sales guy folks always like to do, right? They want to just get that product in the door, and or purchasing wants to do that. And so I'll end there and so to just say it's a very interesting time, and really look forward to the discussion here today. And then the rest of the slides you can have afterwards, just to go through with some of the hot topics. There's no need to go through the rest of here today, so we'll start.
I'm just going to run through them very quickly to get to the next slides.
Okay.
Thanks, Dan. That was really great. And while I do that, I can mention that if you have questions, I forgot to say this at the beginning, but if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, in the chat box, and we'll answer as we go. Lisa, would you share with us?
I sure will. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name's Lisa Lyon, and my contact information is on here. Please feel free to reach out to me if you want to use me as a resource. Again, on a personal level, not representing Avient Corporation. And I put that out there because I think my network, whether it's within company or just within the Professional Trade Association, my network has really meant the world to me. I think it's invaluable to establish that as soon as possible in life, but I'll just put that out there. If you ever need a resource confidentially, someone to swap stories with, to laugh or cry, please feel free to reach out to me. And next slide.
Oh, I don't have any more unless you're done.
Okay. All right. So just a little bit more about myself. I know Joe kind of gave you some high level information. I have been in the industry about 20 years, so that's importing and exporting. And I got my start in the export arena. So that's kind of where my heart is and where my passion is, with the Department of Treasury, State, and Commerce. And then from that, I kind of cut and pasted and learned the import side of things with CBP. So I've got all that alphabet soup, right? The EAR, the ITAR, the FTR. I've been known to be an Incoterms nerd. I just told someone that last week. So I don't know why I hate Incoterms, but I love them at the same time. In terms of the industries that I've worked in, the bulk of my career has been in base metals, primarily in the aluminum industry. So I work for a public-owned corporation, and currently I'm in plastics, and I've been there for a little over 4 years. So very, very many similarities between those two publicly owned companies. And I did have about 4 years with a small manufacturing company based here in Northeast Ohio. I'm lucky enough to lead a team of 13 people globally that are based in US, Canada, Europe, and LATAM. And really, I think we have a very collaborative environment. And as much as I think my name is leader, I really am a student. I'm a student every day. I learn every day, and it's never the same day twice, but I especially learn from all the people on my team. So take that for whatever it means, but just know you're never going to stop learning, especially in this industry. Just like what Dan said, we all have good career paths ahead of us. So let me know again if I can be a resource to you. I'm also a risk mitigator. That's what I try to call myself, in disguise, because when we're working within our own companies, I'm definitely here to push for the strategic initiatives that they're trying to execute. But my true heart, right, is to be a risk mitigator. So navigating through these dynamic landscapes are really difficult. And, kind of like Dan said, right, it's not what it used to be 10 years ago, 20 years ago. That time has passed. And so it's an all new environment for all of us to learn. Ohio native, and happy to be here today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nate.
Thanks, Lisa.
Terrific. Yeah. Thank you. Really honored to be part of this panel here. I want to echo some of the things, in particular what Lisa said. Being a trade advisor, I've been a trade advisor for the last 11 years. And prior to that, I worked in private sector, but it was always things to do with international business. And the focus of my part here is how you can benefit from different resources as you're trying to figure out things for your own professional needs. And whenever you join this webinar, it is true. It kind of takes a village. We lean on one another all the time, and I enjoy hosting programs similar to this, and many times end up reaching out to those individuals for my own assistance, because there's just too many variables. It's a constantly changing environment depending on what your industry is, your product is, what country you're talking about. That country just changed something. They have a new president, and the government get overthrown, whatever. So I certainly don't claim to be the expert in all those things, but I do have the advantage not only of working with a wide variety of companies and hearing about what their issues are and trying to help them solve those issues, but we also have the benefit of relying on state and in some cases federal resources. So I just wanted to give everyone a taste of what some of those resources were. The basic areas that companies come to us for assistance on is they want one-to-one counseling. That's where me as a trade advisor, a state-based trade advisor, can help them. But then there's several other major programs that I will talk about in turn. We have our International Market Support Program, the Internship Program, which Joe had referenced earlier, and then we are the grantor for the Image Grant, which is the Ohio State's version of the STEP grant, which I'll talk about in just a sec. So no matter what state you're in, maybe many of you are from Ohio, but we do have a really strong team here of trade counselors like myself. So in the Cleveland area, there's 3 of us, in fact, but I think Mariah from Youngstown is actually on this call. We have offices in Columbus, Toledo, Dayton, Cincinnati, and in Appalachia, Ohio, based out of Athens. Many other states have similar services, especially if you're in one of the nearby Pittsburgh, I know a couple of the trade advisors, but Pennsylvania, New York has a World Trade Center. Michigan, we know those guys pretty well. So depending on where you're from, you might have a state-based trade advisor. I have a slide in here about the federal services from U.S. Department of Commerce. What we do, our counseling covers a lot of the topics we're discussing here today. Our hope is that we are helping companies advance their export sales. So there's a lot of it on how to enter new markets. What is a distributor? What's an agent? What's the difference? The bare bones about documentation. But we cover the compliance side too. What does a company need to understand? If a company has been asked to address something or fill something out, we could guide them through. Is that something you need to fill out? Is it something that they would just prefer you to fill out? And if so, how could you complete that? And so manage your risk and not overextend yourself. So the state of Ohio maintains its own network of international contractors. So cumulatively, we cover about 140 markets. And you can see here it's basically every major market. So these are individuals that are in country. They are usually native to those countries, and the state will offer to cover the cost of contracts from qualified Ohio companies to do an investigation to find, let's say, a distributor or an agent, or maybe they're looking to build a foreign office, things like this. And we know that this is also something that for many other states, they run something similar to that. So if you're from Ohio and you'd like to learn more, be happy to connect with you and explain. Even if you're not, there's a good chance that I may know who that contact resource is and wherever you're joining us from. I think there's a graphic to this one too. So
There is, thanks.
Yeah. So the state of Ohio has been really fortunate to run for the past 11 years or so an internship program. So this is an opportunity for companies who maybe are looking to maybe have a lot of sort of issues, backlog of projects, things like that no one on your team is perhaps trained to handle. No one has the time to work on it, let's say. We pioneered this program to solve both those things and also to introduce up-and-coming students that are learning international business. We train them in a program that we run ourselves. We qualify them, and through a matchmaking process, set them for 12-week internships in the summer with Ohio companies. This has had a high rate of retention for the companies. It's about a 50% clip, if not better, for the interns either extending their internship or being onboarded as a full-time member of those companies. We know that a couple other states have also I don't want to say copied, but have been inspired from this program. State of Maryland offers something similar. Michigan recently launched their own version of this program. And the sweetener here that I didn't mention is that the state contributes a 50% reimbursement for those students' work and their time. And there is also a graphic for this one. So this is what I mentioned before. The state of Ohio is the grantor to something called the Image Grant, where we give back up to $10,000 for companies to offset the cost of the developmental program. It could be something as simple as translating your website to a different language, or it could be to visit a foreign market. Let's say you're going to go to an overseas trade show. You'd like to find new business partners someplace. So this has been a really popular program, as you can imagine, but it is our piece of the State Trade Expansion Program, which is a federal grant run through the SBA. So this is one that almost every U.S. state has some version of, the STEP grant. We don't do this by ourselves in the world of international trade advising. In addition to the wonderful people who are on this panel, we frequently are partnering with the U.S. Commercial Service, and every major U.S. city has the U.S. Commercial Service office. There may also be some of you on this call who are representing, let's say, a food, agricultural-based product. So there's the FAS, Foreign Agricultural Service. They have specialized services for either commodities, if you're brokering grains, I don't know, soy, corn, whatever, or processed food. There's a whole separate division. There's a whole separate form of grants and assistance. And that's always fun when we're helping companies, trying to sell cat food or I don't know, whatever it might be. There's a whole different world that we could introduce you to specific to that. Just a couple others that I mentioned here, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers. This is a cross-border alliance between two Canadian provinces and all the Great Lakes states. And one of their missions is in advancing trade. So they frequently run trade missions to other markets. And that's a terrific asset for us in the Great Lakes area. The SBA and the EXIM Bank, I won't steal any of Andrew's thunder, but there are multiple programs, and that trade finance area is just a delightful area to help reduce the financial risk involved in selling abroad. This is just to say, we offer all kinds of training because people come to us all the time asking, I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. Can you give me something that's a little more hands-on? So we do everything from individual training, professional training, full-on company training. We run an export accelerator program, which is our global target. And so we do this on an ongoing basis. Last thing that I want to throw in here is that we're also part of something called I am personally part of NASBITE International, which, if you haven't heard, is the National Association of Small Business International Trade Educators. So this is mostly national. It's based out of Albany, New York, but we also have international members. Our focus of this group is to provide training education. And the insert here is a trade training library that we have called Trade Passport. It's free to sign up for. There's about 80 or so pre-recorded webinars. I have 3 of them up there, for example. You can sign up and you can watch 20 for free, as much as you want. After that, I think they ask you to pay a little something. But that's a really popular go-to place for someone who just wants to do some self-learning. They're all curated and they're fairly up to date. So, and I think those are just a couple of links. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. Okay, so I have some questions that were sent in, and I also just have some general questions. And then if you want to type in any questions as we go and you think of something. Andrew, would you start us off by telling us in general what trade finance is and who should know about it? I know that you did a little bit at the beginning.
Sure. So this is a little bit of a bookish kind of a definition, but I would just borrowing it from some folks. Trade finance is the use of tools and techniques to mitigate international and domestic risks and ensure payment to exporters and delivery of goods to importers. So, as I had mentioned, primarily work on the credit insurance piece, but ultimately, we work kind of to plug in maybe a little bit of EXIM Bank and some of those resources. So if you are a U.S. exporter that has a product that is manufactured in the U.S. or that has greater than 50% U.S. content, then you're eligible to utilize some of the EXIM Bank resources. So one of the first piece of kind of the trade finance puzzle is when you have that potential sale abroad. If you're negotiating the terms, if you are offering anything that's like a net 30, net 60, if even up to, multi-year, for capital equipment, you can utilize Ex-Im Bank. And so what we do in that role would be to kind of qualify the customer, look at the markets that they're selling into, and then, prepare an application. And to give you a sense of general sort of pricing, on the insurance for something like a net 60 for a small business, new exporter, you could potentially insure that risk for roughly 0.65% based on the limit on your exposure. So, kind of to jump back with trade finance, again, we try to bridge, the exporter with, they have to make sure that they're able to procure the items needed to produce the goods. So sometimes we help with negotiating with some of their suppliers in order to get more favorable terms. Sometimes we're working directly with if it's especially with capital equipment, we're working with their buyer, because ultimately their buyer may be purchasing a $500,000 piece of equipment, and they might be needing 5 years to repay that. So we'll actually work with their buyer overseas. We'll review some financials, and we'll put them through the systems where Ex-Im Bank can help cover that risk. So again, I guess trade finance are kind of, it's a tool used to help you grow your sales, your international sales, while protecting you against the unforeseen. So, very often you could have a company in a country with maybe it's a riskier country, maybe a riskier political climate, where the customer themselves might be a very strong financial risk or a very low risk. But because of the political risk, the potential for a government stepping in and maybe preventing an import of an item, or nationalizing the company, or potential for a currency devaluation, you'll want to mitigate that. So that's one reason why people will work with Ex-Im Bank and with us. The other component would be where you're selling to, very low risk markets, but maybe the customer could have a riskier profile, or a scenario which we've had a few times, where maybe you don't have that relationship, with the customer. We had one exporter, who'd been selling into Europe through distributors, and something happened with that distributor relationship. So they ended up going to a direct sales model. They didn't have those direct relationships. So that was one of the ways that they were able to get over that hurdle and build those relationships, was to utilize Ex-Im Bank to help qualify those customers and allow them to sell. So I guess if as far as who should know about it, certainly anyone in the trade space, anyone in the finance space, and certainly in the sales, the sales teams should certainly know about it. And probably most importantly, when utilizing these tools and when strategizing about what terms should we be offering, or which markets should we tackle, absolutely be sure that there's communication between the risk and the finance folks and the sales folks. They, where it works best is when they're working in harmony.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you very much. Dan, can you tell us how you got into trade law and what made you decide to stay with this area?
There's a lot of nights I stare at the ceiling asking myself the same question, after a long day. Really, I think I was a Buckeye, so I was at Ohio State, spent some time overseas, just study abroad type things in Europe. Actually, Miami University's program, they let some of us riffraff Buckeyes in there over in Luxembourg. And then when I went to Case Western for law school, and Case Western in Cleveland has one of the top ranked international programs, and some of the original those folks that I talked about, some of the architects of the world in which we live today, people like Henry King and Sidney Picker and others were professors there, and were really the deans of the International Trade Bar. You couldn't go to an event in Cleveland that was an international business event that they didn't start. Like, they created those organizations, those folks, and then just through that, I was more public international law focused, and then just started to really understand that the best way to help companies, the best way to help, where I was from in Ohio and the region, et cetera, was really trade, which is very different than kind of the political sentiment, right, in some of the parts, but they're striking that balance. And it's been a rewarding career because, as I've said, it's exciting for me oftentimes because there are companies, when they're ready to grow, they'll use exporting. And so you get to be there on the growth curve. It's also, for many companies, I think one of the things that still surprises a lot of people is some of the largest companies that I work with are some of the least mature in terms of trade compliance, that it's just, transportation and trade kind of always ran sidecar with the rest of the operations. And then now the world in which we live, it's just taken a premium. And so that's fun when you can help design those programs and work with great people like we have on this panel and build those things out. So yeah, it's exciting. I never thought I'd be doing it for 20 odd years, but here we are. But no, and as I said, just to end where I started, is that the time in which we live now, I just can't imagine how companies are not engaged in trade, in the trade world. I'm just hard pressed to find companies that are able to sit back and say, we're just not involved in trade. That list of companies that doesn't come see Nate or others is growing smaller and smaller, just because everybody at some point realizes they're touched by these issues. And I think COVID brought that home for companies. I think COVID brought that home for the population. When you go to the grocery store and there's not toilet paper on the shelves, it's like, whoa, what's going on here? And those, I think folks woke up to that, and that's the world we live in now. So
yeah, thank you. Lisa, can you tell us about your role in a business as trade compliance and kind of why it matters? I know Dan just touched on it a little bit, but what have you built up over time?
I think ultimately we're here to help keep the business running. We're here for business continuity and to support those strategic initiatives, right? And probably a big key to that is just even having the organization know that you're here and to get invited to the table and to participate, not reactively, but proactively on those strategic initiatives. And the business will find out over time that they need to invite you sooner. And I'm happy to say that I think we've made some great strides with that since I've been here. We do have a great team that's resourced in the areas that I told you about. And sometimes I think, well, we really kind of do work that's in two buckets. We do work that's transactionally based every day, right? We're doing denied party screenings like crazy, right? Left and right. We're doing those tariff classifications, export control numbers, free trade agreements, preferential duty opportunities, licenses, exemptions. And then we're also like making sure the import-export clearances happen, right? Got to make sure the business is running. But we have to balance that with kind of the strategic side, like I was talking about, getting invited to those strategic initiative meetings, but also like making sure our partners, like our freight forwarders and customs brokers, are doing what they're supposed to be doing the way that they're supposed to be doing it. And then also making sure you have all your contracts and everything in place to keep that going. And that sometimes takes a significant amount of time, even with like your software providers. We also do, from a strategic standpoint, our supply chain security programs, and all that fun interaction with all the different government agencies, right? And along with that, a lot of our own internal auditing. So I think it's just important to know you're here to keep the business running, but you want to keep it running as compliantly as possible. And to mitigate risk, you're never, ever going to get rid of all the risk. You're going to lose that battle. Okay.
Mhm.
So risk-based approach, try to take one bite at a time and continually work to mitigate little by little what you find.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Nate, what do you wish you'd known about international business when you got started?
What I wish I knew, that there was such a helpful community. For many years in the beginning there, I struggled to find out the answers myself. I think when I started doing this, in my profession, somebody just handed down a book to me that had been prepared by someone who had left the company probably years before that, and was just sort of told, fill in this, do this. This is how we always handle this, and we're not sure if it's right. And it was. It just felt very much in the dark, and no one seemed to understand why we do what we do. Are we supposed to do this or not? And then inevitably problems would happen, and then we would just all sort of say, well, I guess that's just the way the game is played, and we'd all have to suffer through it. But eventually, when I got tapped into this community of people who had been there, had done that, who experienced it, in some ways you were able to find, oh, this is the shortcut, or you can outsource this to someone that's a specialist, and they're worth their weight in gold because they know what they're doing, and they'll keep you free from the risk associated with it. And if you did it yourself, it's going to take you an ungodly amount of time. So I think, first of all, to been tapped into that community, that's really what I wish I would have known from the get-go. And now I get to be part of that community, and every day and every time I meet someone, people say, gosh, I wish I would have known you guys were around 10 years ago or something like that. And we're a fairly tight-knit group, I think. Small but mighty, and we all tend to know one another. And it's, somebody said it's like a 2-telephone town. Like if I don't know the answer, I sure as heck know somebody that would know the answer. And it's amazing just how generous individuals in this trade community can be with their time and their energy.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with all of that. Thank you. Andrew, this I think is one of our most fun questions. What trends are you seeing currently in the trade finance area?
Sure. So, generally, as far as, well, for trade finance, I would say that there's probably more that there are just more solutions out there, more non-bank solutions. So you're seeing a lot of, in the last, 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of fintech kind of investment into this space. So, and there's been a little bit of a pullback from traditional banking. Just a lot of the former kind of international banking heads, finance folks, the support folks, a lot of them have retired, or the banks are just maybe paring down there. So you're seeing a lot kind of a leaner sort of a finance type tools out there, more transaction based. Ultimately, one of the limitations with credit insurance, outside of, say, Exim Bank, is that it can be fairly costly if you're just trying to insure or put together one sale. There's typically going to be about a minimum premium of probably about $25,000 if you're just going to insure that. If you're working with a finance company, because a lot of times what our customers, I would say that the biggest trend recently, especially during the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, is folks that are looking to not only mitigate the risk, but also basically have the transaction more or less paid for. They need the finance to fund the purchase of the products that they're selling, and they need the finance to basically factor or kind of sell their receivable when the purchase is made, so they have more cash flow. So I think just seeing a lot more kind of smaller companies, more startup companies that are looking to transact business, that are utilizing some of these non-traditional finance tools to kind of provide a one-stop sort of a turnkey solution. Now, where we, of course, our bread and butter is always working with manufacturers that have a track record, or maybe they have a track record in the U.S. and they're looking to expand internationally. But the great thing is that there are more and more tools every year for folks of all shapes and sizes and experience levels.
Awesome, thank you. Dan, now it's your turn. What kind of trends are you seeing, maybe in the enforcement area, but in general in the legal section of trade?
Well, sure. I mean, there's kind of trends everywhere in those lines, but I think what others have said is spot on. On the enforcement side, right now, forced labor is a big issue. Of course, anything coming from Xinjiang area in China, there's a group out there, a private sector group that basically publishes a report and then and says, here's all the bad stuff that's coming in, and now then you see enforcement around it. And so, interestingly, originally it was cotton, solar panels, et cetera. Automotive was hit in December, and there's a lot of activity on that front now. But I think there's a lot of activity as well right now on the de minimis rule, the $800 rule. Which we affectionately used to call the UPS rule, where customs law was changed, of course, for shipments of $800 or less. You don't have to go through all the customs process. And it was a huge issue I was involved in during USMCA, because Canada and Mexico are different standards. But there's a strong view right now that is allowing forced labor made goods along with fentanyl and other types of things to slip in through the system. So I think the more issues get bundled, so that issue has been around for a while under fentanyl, but now that it's basketed with forced labor, I think that's getting a lot of attention in Washington on the Hill and in the administration. And so I think to the extent, forced labor is hot right now. And I think a lot of companies say, well, we're not importing from Xinjiang. But the compliance piece of that, along with ESG type measures, environmental social governance measures, just really require that transparency and traceability in the supply chain, which really places a premium on technology solutions, right? And just being able to know where your products are coming from. I did see in that vein a question come in on the Q&A here asking about it. I don't know if Joe, if you mind if I just jump into it.
About CARM.
It was about CARM, which is Canada's program. Again, I'm not speaking for the government of Canada, but Canada's had its CARM initiative, which it's its customs modernization initiative. It's been going on forever, frankly. But it was scheduled to come into force this fall. It looks like it's getting bounced out again to the spring of next year. But U.S. companies will be required, and so you can get all of the registration numbers online. You just register as a business entity. In Canada, you should have those, so you should be able to do it. It's just, will it ever come into effect? It's going to have to at some point, but it's been bumped out. But there's notice and comment right now on, I would flag for companies out there that are non-resident importers into Canada, where Canada is proposing, CBSA, Canada Border Services Agency, is changing its valuation rules, where it's not the price of the imported good at import, the purchase price, it's when the importer imports it and then sells it in Canada, that will be the declared value. That has significant changes for potential companies that are shipping into Canada as non-resident importers. So it's something to keep an eye on. And those are the types of things, just ending on the question asked, is those are the types of things that we're seeing too, is there's these big picture, tariffs, China and forced labor and everything else. But there's a lot of issues around valuation rules and those types of regulatory, those behind the border type issues that are really where I think countries are starting to become very active, that require that type of regulatory focus as well, in terms of just not that at the border trade clearance issues. Going to Andrew and Lisa's earlier point of linking as be part of the team, have a seat at the table with finance and others. Because these aren't always considered in those conversations. But those valuation issues, that NERI issue is significant. I'm on the board of the American Chamber of Commerce in Canada. We're taking a very active position on that. So if companies want to talk more, happy to connect you to the folks or have conversations myself.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that was a great heads up.
Can I just piggyback off of that?
Yes.
That's also something that we see quite a lot. I think that there are lots of countries right now that governments are struggling with loss in tax revenue. And I think they are trying to invent new ways of tightening the reins on that. We recently helped out a company that sells into the European Union, and the European Union has been trying to also revamp their import process to capture some of that. There's, so I think this is a trend in the last couple of years that we're seeing more and more of governments getting creative of how they're trying to recoup the lost revenue through internet-based sales. And I think as a corollary to that, just the advent of more higher usage of internet-based things, privacy as well, of how are we going to safeguard privacy? How are we going to clamp down on, identity theft? And different countries are moving at different speeds, and they're not always in alignment with what we do in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Can I also tag on? So Dan, you mentioned with forced labor that there's a private sector group that publishes a report. Is that something that's like publicly available and free that you can send us the link or?
Yeah, happy to. I'm trying, I can never remember the name, but it has a very flowery name, but it basically looks at, so as I said, they published it in December and it was automotive, and next thing you know, everybody was looking at automotive, and they just did one a few weeks ago. So I'll actually put it into the chat here while we're talking.
Awesome. Wonderful. And I'll post that online. Thanks.
Joe, just to piggyback off of Nate, he was talking about some cyber risks and identity theft. Just one thing that we've certainly seen more of, and this is another reason why, sales and risk need to be speaking, but probably more importantly, also the sales, your international sales team needs to be speaking with the customer directly, is just change of payment details, where somebody comes in with a similar kind of an email address, puts themselves into the email conversation, changes the wire instructions, wire is made, funds are never received, so there's certainly an increase in that sort of fraud. And so that's one of those things we always tell people, if ever there's any discussion about payment terms or anything changing, make sure you have somebody that's you're speaking to over the phone, to confirm that. And in big picture, it's always going to be better if you at least are meeting the people once every so often in person, because we also have the scenarios where, sometimes there are sales opportunities that just seem too good to be true, and they actually are, where there's somebody who provides some fraudulent information or is kind of taking advantage of a unique situation, and you think you're shipping to an agent of the company and it's someone else. So again, that just kind of goes back to that KYC type of mentality.
Yeah, thank you. So Lisa, as our Incoterms nerd, I'm just going to ask you a question that came in. You may not be the only person who answers this, but what sort of errors do we see when people are using Incoterms? Are there common ones you notice?
Lots of them. I mean, like one of the favorite, we all know this, right, is that you got the FOB, which is a UCC term, Uniform Commercial Code for like domestic purposes. That gets screwed up with the Incoterms FOB all the time. So I'd say that's a very common one. People tend to use Xworks when they're buying and they have no appropriate measures to actually export or import the goods, right? I mean, they don't even know what Xworks means. And probably the reverse with DDP. You can get maybe your seller to agree to DDP, and then you find out at the tail end they have no intention of importing it into your country. So I think those are pretty common. I'd say with the C terms, I rarely see people doing the names, place of destination and the name, place of delivery. I give bonus points when I see that. I think that is just unbelievably awesome, and it's great CYA. But I rarely see that, and I just I preach it all the time. I don't even think it's a best practice. I think it's just smart business.
Yeah.
And, if you ever take any of the Incoterms training, Frank Reynolds will tell you that, right? So overall, maybe just kind of like a lack of understanding. I think that's also very common about really what Incoterms do and don't do. And some people think it is title transfer, and it's not. Some people think it's revenue recognition, and it's not. So just kind of getting that basic understanding is a lot.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I want to wrap up on time, which means I'm going to ask each of you, do you have anything else that you would like to throw in and add as we're closing? Any last thoughts that you want to share? Andrew, you want to start? Or I can start with someone else.
Yeah, start with someone else.
Okay, Nate, do you want to go? Oh, Lisa. Yeah.
I got one. Trust your instinct. If it doesn't feel right, it's probably not.
Yeah.
Don't shortcut it. Dive in.
Thank you. Nate, how about you?
One other thing I want to add is we've recently submitted for a substantial federal grant to run a new program specifically for minority-owned companies, and this is minority in every sense of the term. So if you happen to work for or are an owner of a company and you happen to be based in Ohio, although even if you're not, we would be interested in speaking with you. So this would be a program to train up and help develop a company's full potential for international business, and it would include a couple of paid-for trips to other countries. So I'll kind of leave it at that, but contact me if you'd like to learn more information about it.
Well, that's really neat. Thank you. Dan, how about you?
Yeah, I would just echo exactly what Lisa said, and Andrew touched on it earlier. Just because of this level of activity in international, it's become just ripe with opportunities for whether it's nefarious parties, scammers, but also just getting, something that's completely legitimate, but somebody understands this being one way and somebody understands you're saying it this way, and all of a sudden your compliance program and I get into those situations at times, right, where we have to call timeout because the business wants to make the sale or do something, and it's often tough, to say no. It's at times you have to say no, let's slow down here and let's do this right. We're not saying no permanently. We're not saying no and we're not doing this. It's no, let's make sure we're checking through all the steps. And unfortunately, I've seen some situations recently where, things were moving too fast and not all the information was provided and you get yourself into a jam. So I think trust your gut. And trust but verify as well is a good piece of advice.
Yeah. Thank you. Andrew.
Well, I'll just say ditto to everything Dan just said, and then just to add to that, kind of to paraphrase what everyone else has mentioned, resources, if you have questions on any of these topics, just between the four of us, as Nate said, we're pretty much connected to, all the different state agencies, federal agencies, all the different practitioners. It's a great network. Feel free to reach out to me, connect with me on LinkedIn. And then if you wanted just a resource specifically on trade finance, there's actually I think it's called the Guide to Trade Finance that's put out by the U.S. Commercial Service. It's Ohio-based director, Yuki Fujiyama, that actually wrote this. But I would suggest searching that, or we can provide, a link or something to that. I think it's about
I'll provide a link to that. Thank
guide,
you.
and it's kind of a who's who of different U.S. government, resources, and just some of the building blocks of trade finance. So I think that's a great place to start.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I want to seriously, panelists, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. And it is so valuable even to learn about your programs and get your knowledge and your contact information. We really appreciate it. Here is the code for NCB FAA continuing education credits if you'd like. That's all that we have today. This is contact information, and we'll include that when we send out information for everyone. Again, thanks so much, panelists. Thank you, attendees. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Joe.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.